Hi everyone, it's QuickyBaby and welcome back to World of Tanks, and today I've got a full tank review for you of a brand new Tier 8 premium Italian tank destroyer. It is the Vipera. This thing has an autoloader, a 5-round autoloader that is capable of doing 2,000 damage, albeit in 24 seconds of the first shot, and that is because this vehicle has a whopping intra-clip reload of 6 seconds. So while it's not really going to be able to burst damage out like a regular kind of autoloader, it's still doing substantially amounts of more damage than other tank destroyers are able to do if they are firing on reload. Combine this with Juggernaut armor and enough turret traverse dispersion to still go 45 degrees to the left and 45 degrees to the right, and this might be the new tank destroyer king at tier 8. And that's what I'm going to be trying to figure out today. Is this vehicle all that? So firstly, I want to clarify something incredibly important, and that is that I'm going to be playing a version of the Vipera today that is better than the version that will be released with the 1.18 update and when the vehicle is available in the premium store today upon the release of this video, which I'm preparing in advance. The tank will have a 30km/h top speed limit, not a 32 like I'm playing with today, and the vehicle is going to have 1,300 hit points and not the 1,400 hit points that I'm going to be playing through today. So a thumbs up to Wargaming for seeing that this vehicle needed to have a few of its statistics filed off instead of filed up or increased on release day. So it's really hard to decide what to compare the Vipera to, considering it has this fairly unique intra-clip reload of 6 seconds, but a fairly short reload of 24 for a magazine that is capable of doing 2,000 damage. Also, there are not many other autoloading tank destroyers at tier 8. There's only the AMX AC-48 and there's the GSAW 1008. But I would also argue that the Vipera is kind of comparable to a TS5, which is kind of the strongest tank destroyer at tier 8 in the game right now. So right off the bat, we notice that the Vipera has a better damage per minute than the other two auto-loading tank destroyers, but its penetration is less at 220. And if you thought this thing was going to get good premium rounds, you might be disappointed. 264 is definitely not great for a tank destroyer when a TS5 is packing 300 and something like the GSAW is packing 321. Nevertheless, the Vipera actually gets fantastic high explosive rounds with 515 alpha damage and 120mm of penetration. And this will pump up your damage per minute substantially and allow you to deal 2,575 damage per magazine in 24 seconds, of course, if you're able to penetrate those high explosive rounds. The crazy thing about the Vipera is that unlike the AMX AC-48, which also has a 120mm and 400 alpha damage, it has a 6-second intra-clip reload, over double that of the AMX AC-48. Meaning that the French tank destroyer is able to dump out its damage in half the time of the Vipera. However, the Vipera has that big 5-round magazine with 2,000 damage that will allow it to keep going for longer and then have a 36-second reload time to reload 5 120mm shells, whereas the AMX AC-48 reloads 3 in 34 seconds. So that shows you only 2 extra seconds to reload 2 extra shells is not a bad thing for the Vipera, and that's why it ends up with very good damage per minute, even though it has a terrible intra-clip reload. But what you might be thinking is, considering the Vipera has this 6-second intra-clip reload, and you might be seeing that the TS5 takes 8.5 seconds to reload, that's not actually the case, because remember, if you don't have an autoloader, you can use things like a gun rammer. You can combine this with things like vents on the vehicle, and when you start to take into things like brothers in arms, and maybe even using a premium consumable on the TS5, then suddenly the reload of the TS5 is down to 6.59, and that is with standard equipment, albeit a premium consumable. And let's be honest, that is not too different to the Vipera's 6-second intra-clip reload. And remember, with something like a TS5, if you need a high explosive round or you need a heat round, then you don't have to reload an entire magazine to be able to achieve that. So while undoubtedly it's terrifying that the Vipera can deal 2,000 damage in 24 seconds of the first shot, and that will give it more damage per minute than something like a TS5, even if it's fully equipped for a damage build out, keep in mind that it's barely firing faster than the TS5 because of that intra-clip reload, and then the TS5 doesn't have to have a 36-second reload time after it's dumped out its 5 shells. So that means that when you're playing and also playing against the Vipera, you should consider that when it's reloaded, it's kind of like a TS5, but it will have that downtime after it fires 5 shots. So don't think this is going to be some kind of new outrageous consistent damage dealer that's going to be able to do huge amounts of damage like a TS5 if it's allowed to fire on reload, of course. What these new Italian tank destroyers effectively do is they store up a large amount of burst damage, which is still very fearsome, but then they have to have downtime to be able to balance it out. And then this allows the Vipera to be able to gain statistics in other areas that the TS5 doesn't have. So let's move on to gun handling. Now the Vipera has a terrible aim time of 3 seconds, awful accuracy of 0.44, which is not great at all, like the TS5. It has bad dispersion when it's moving of 0.25, but okay turret traverse dispersion of 0.1, and also tank traverse of 0.1 as well. So that means that when you're using the semi-traversable turret, which can go 45 degrees to the left and 45 degrees to the right on this tank, as we can see here, that you're not actually going to have too much bloom when you are turning the turret on this vehicle, and you probably don't want to end up using something like a rotation device on this tank, in my opinion, although it doesn't have the best turret traverse at 18 degrees a second, so it's really going to be up to you about how you want to play it. One thing for certain is this thing is not a sniper, but as I'm going to show you when I recommend equipment, that you can still set it up a little bit like one, but it's definitely not going to be able to dump out rounds like a G-Saw or an AMX AC-48. So now let's move on to the mobility of the Vipera. And keep in mind, as I said earlier, it's not going to be 32, it's going to be 30 limited top speed going forwards. The vehicle doesn't have the best power to weight ratio as well at 11.72, but luckily its ground resistances aren't horrific, and so if you end up using a turbo and you take the ground resistance improvements on this vehicle, it actually can still end up being pretty nippy, and it does stay at the vehicle's top speed limit of 30. Be warned, however, that until you have things like off-road driving and clutch braking, the traverse speed on this vehicle can feel a little bit poor. But again, because Wargaming did a terrible job of balancing out field mods for tank destroyers and they just gave them an I win button, the Vipera probably ends up being a lot faster than it probably should. So now let's move on to the armor of this vehicle, and this is where this thing is truly outrageous. 210 millimeters of hull armor, 100 at the side and 50 at the rear, and 275 millimeters of frontal turret armor with 160 on the side and 50 at the rear. That gives the Vipera absolutely god tier armor. This is as if you had 220 millimeters shooting at the front of it. Doesn't really have a weak point on top. If it's using any of its gun depression, you're not going to be able to take advantage of the top of this tank at all. And the only thing that you can do is you can overmatch the lower plate, but that's only if you have a 91 millimeter caliber gun. If, for example, you were, I don't know, one of my favorite tanks, a Comet, and you were firing gold against the Vipera, good luck. There's practically nothing that you can do to the front of this tank, even if you're firing gold, and you're going to have to get to the side. Now, what happens if you have gold rounds, 264 millimeters of pen? Well, that means that the mid plate becomes a bit more of a weak point, but the turret is still absolutely awesome. And if the vehicle ends up using its 10 degrees of gun depression, well, good luck going through its upper hull now, unless you have about 300 millimeters of penetration. The Vipera, however, does have one significant weakness, and that is this 40 millimeter plate on top of the tank, which means that you could fire high explosive rounds and you would do substantial damage. Or alternatively, if you have a 121 millimeter caliber gun, for example, as if you were playing a 112, which has 122, you can see that you can overmatch the whole of the forehead if you have armor-piercing rounds. Another thing to mention about the Vipera is that this whole underflap area here is also only 20 millimeters thick. And so this means that if the tank crests a ridgeline against you and you get a chance, shoot up under its track and you're going to be able to overmatch this with all 61 millimeter caliber guns and larger. Now let's imagine that you have pretty good heat rounds, for example 250 millimeters of heat pen like on the 112. Well, you're really not going to want to still go through that upper hull, but keep in mind that when the tank does turn, its armor is actually not all that thick. And so if you do get the side turret on a Vipera, and you can get yourself about 230, 240 millimeters of penetration, you can easily go through this. It's not going to do you very good if you're a tier 6 or a tier 7 medium tank, but at least it should help still a little bit. Another little opportunity that you will have is this bar of armor at the back of the tank. That will be penetratable by heat rounds. It will be also overmatchable by a 120mm caliber guns. But keep in mind, if you don't have a 120mm caliber gun, like on the 110, you will not be able to overmatch this flap, and it is not a weak point. All in all, this tank is a terrifying prospect. The fact that you can have 265mm of penetration and barely be able to go through the front of the tank more than 40-45% of the time, even when you're firing gold, is absolutely outrageous. And if this vehicle ends up using its gun depression, good blooming luck trying to go through the front of this thing, and its turret is up to about 320. Now, of course, if the thing ends up against tier 10 tanks, like a 113, for example, then its armor is not looking too good, and if it fires heat, then yeah, pretty much the whole of the Vipera becomes an absolute joke. But all this really does is it means that this tank can play very, very, very aggressively against your tier 6, 7, and 8 tanks, but as soon as you play against tier 9 and tier 10s, that have access to good high explosive anti-tank rounds, your armor is going to be absolutely worthless. So a passing mention should be made to the hit points of the vehicle, which is going to be 1,300 on release. As I said, the fact that this vehicle's camo rating is not that bad, even when it's moving, but it does get a disappointing 360 meters view range. That means that even if you take the field mod that increases the view range of the vehicle, unless you have recon, situational awareness, brothers at arms, a premium consumable, you still aren't really going to be able to get up to a very healthy amount of view range unless you're using coated optics, which is definitely a downside on a juggernaut tank destroyer like this. So now I want to give some equipment recommendations, and I'm going to be using 2 builds on my Vipera personally. I'm going to be using vents, durability, and a turbo on this tank. And that is for when you end up on your city maps like Himmelsdorf, Ensk, Berlin, Runeberg, and you just want to be an absolute brawling tank. Then I'm going to have a second build on this vehicle where I'm going to be using an aiming device to improve the accuracy, vents, and also coated optics. Now I'm going to be slower, I'm not going to be so durable, but I can now get up to about 478 meters view range, even with standard vents, and my accuracy gets vastly improved to 0.35, where I feel like it's going to be manageable. Field mods wise on this vehicle, it is very simple. You always take reinforced suspension. Then I would thoroughly recommend improving the accuracy of this vehicle and also improving the view range, because who needs concealment after firing? I personally am going to end up taking a survivability slot, but if you feel you want the extra view range on this vehicle, then maybe a scouting slot would be more suitable for you. As this is going to be the first Italian tank destroyer that many of you will get your hands on if you purchase it inside the premium store, then I want to give a passing mention to the crew that this vehicle uses. It has a commander who's also the radio operator, then it has a gunner, a driver, and a loader. I would thoroughly recommend to use a premium crew member, i.e. one that has brothers in arms for free on your commander, as this is a very high pressure role. You are going to have situational awareness, you are going to have recon, you're going to have brothers in arms, as well as also having repairs, sixth sense, possibly concealment as well. Otherwise you're going to be under a tremendous amount of pressure and not being able to spot your opponents. And it's all fine and well only having 400 meters view range with a durability setup like this until you've won that city fight, and then you want to actually try and spot some tanks as you push out of the city and maybe make your way towards the field. Anyway, you know what? I think that's quite enough jibber jabber. Why don't we jump into some combat with a Vipera so I can show you exactly what this vehicle's all about. Alrighties then, so firstly we are rolling out on Paris and we're in a top tier matchup against tier 8 and tier 7 tanks. Spoilers, I'm not going to be showing you any gameplay against tier 10 vehicles in this tank because I've played about 10 games and for some reason I just couldn't really manage to get against them. But like, do you even really need to for me to show you what happens when high penetration rounds are hitting this vehicle with gold? It's flat armor. It is not going to work against vehicles like that. It's going to be very simple, straightforward. All the rounds are going to go in. Now, if you end up playing against tier 9 and tier 10 tanks, what you're effectively going to have to do then is to be a little bit sneaky, play like a support vehicle, and you're not going to be able to play like a juggernaut. I feel like in this tank review, what is going to be more interesting for you to see is that the unique aspect of gameplay that the Vipera will present to you, and that is when it gets to play like a juggernaut. So of course, I'm on a close quarters combat city map, so I'm going to be using my vents, durability, and turbo build. This is going to give me enough mobility to get into position. Importantly, it's going to give me enough mobility to be able to pull back from a situation, and I'm going to have the vents to be able to maximize the firepower with the durability to protect my tracks and to pump up the impressive amount of hit points that this vehicle has. So the gun handling on this vehicle, definitely not great, but you know what, I feel like just taking a chance against that Skoda T56. I wanted to set the tempo against him, and then set the tempo against the Tiger. And look at this burst damage. This is what 4,000 DPM looks like when the Vipera is actually fully loaded. And we're just absolutely clapping, and the enemies can't seem to do anything to our vehicle at all. We put 4 rounds in on a row. Skoda's struggling to figure out what he can do against me, and then I'm going to put another round in. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of YouTube, that is a perfect mag in the Vipera. It's just 2,000 damage. Just put all of your 5 shots in, and I blocked 2,400 damage as well. This thing is outrageous. One thing that I just want to clarify, by the way, and this is literally about less than 12 hours before the NDA is up on this tank, is that Wargaming just changed another one of the aspects of the vehicle that will be going into the patch tomorrow. And that is that they are nerfing the weak point on the lower plate from 30 down to 20, which means that it will be overmatched by all 61mm caliber guns and not 91mm caliber guns. So use that to your knowledge. Okay, well, I guess, you know, when your vehicle is that OP, the enemies need to start to think about actually maybe using their vehicles as the weapon when their guns aren't working. As the VZ-44-1 crashes on top of me, actually ends up destroying themselves on me, although they did put in a decent amount of damage. It's actually put me down to a low enough hit points where I might even actually fall at the end of this battle. 4,000 damage dealt in less than 3 minutes and 3,600 damage blocked. You know what, I can pretty much end the review here, really. Well, the Ferdinand's going to do it for me. This vehicle is outrageous. For those kind of situations where players don't know how to aim at it yet, this thing is disgustingly OP. So, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is why you come here. Shoot the lower plate. It's going to be 20mm thick and you'll be able to overmatch it. And if you're unable to do that, as I said in my tank review, if you can catch the top with 121mm caliber guns, do that. If not, then try and shoot in the flaps under here. This vehicle is outrageously good, and it just seems like such an easy tank to play. Sure, you have the downtime where hopefully your opponents aren't going to rush you and take you down because they're counting your shots. But if you can survive those downtime periods, usually you've punished so many vehicles in the process that they're kind of on the back foot. This thing's outrageous. So let's go again. This time, a similar kind of matchup and a similar kind of map. We're going to be playing on Berlin. This is the bread and butter situation for this vehicle. I'm going to be using, again, my close quarters combat build for this tank. We've got vents, durability, turbo, which is going to give me all of the aspects that I need to control the engagement against my opponents and to hopefully be able to deliver those shots at close range. After this, I'm going to show you an example of where we're actually using our coated optics and our accuracy build on this tank. But, just have to wait for that one because it's quite an interesting replay. Alright, so the Vipera, it's definitely not slow. This Pantera is side-scraping in possibly one of the most interesting situations that I've ever seen in my life. I tell him to fall back because he's literally blocking the entirety of our advance and not really achieving too much. But, you know what, buddy? You do you. So we fire a shell on the move against the 50 TP. We're unable to be able to go through the vehicle, but luckily they didn't manage to track us nor be able to shut us down. In this kind of situation, I'm thinking, oh, this is a little bit awkward. Luckily, we dodged the artillery shell, we go back up, and I'm just trying to look for shells on this 50 TP, and also just test this armor a little bit. Now we can see just how awkward this relatively poor standard pen combined with this horrific accuracy is at trying to be able to hit weak points. And whoa, the 50 TP actually damaged my tank and managed to damage my tracks at the same time. I wonder how he managed to do that. So I'm on my press account. If you wonder I have sound detection, I think it's one of the most useless skills in World of Tanks, unless you're deaf. Yeah, if you're deaf, it's actually fantastic. And I think that players who are deaf should probably be given sound detection for free across all of their vehicles, because it will provide them that visual aid to something that we're all lucky enough to be using our ears to be able to distinguish when the artillery has fired at us and which direction it came from. So I actually lost 8 100? Nearly 900 hit points to a 50 TP? What happened? Well, he's using his knowledge. Well, maybe he's not using his knowledge, but he's fishing around and he got a good opportunity. He managed to figure out very quickly. He's called Avocado on the enemy team to find out where the weak point is on the Vipera. And that is that he managed to overmatch my underflap, shot up into the tank, took out the tracks, and also managed to hit that lovely juicy 20mm plate that runs all along the side of the vehicle that I've been trying to hammer home to all of you, that you're going to have to be sneaky when you engage this vehicle. It's not enough to just dump rounds at the vehicle's front. Did that Crusader fail to do any damage to the front of my vehicle? Pretty outrageous. You're going to have to look for those overmatch angles. Luckily, even while I'm stunned there with my horrible bloom, I'm still able to get the 50 TP prototype and kind of make it a little bit more even. It's definitely not even yet. I'm going to have to put these other 4 rounds in before I really feel that I've truly got even with that 50 TP. But I really wanted to show you this replay to highlight that when you play against players who do know what they're doing, then the armor on this vehicle is far from perfect. Alright, Mr. Chiri, are you going to have a go at us? You know what, I think these rounds are important to me right now, so I'm not even going to fire at them. We bounce the IS-3 off the side. I take a chancey shot to see if I can get him. That 6 seconds intra-clip reload definitely feels a little bit long. And you know what, if the T-34-100 wants to go around to the left, well, I'm going to go around the right, because I don't want to approach the 50 TP from the same direction. And now I'm down to 460 hit points, which means I'm actually going to be able to one-shot for that tank. Alright, so this Lerva seems to be just a little bit casual. I guess he's not quite able to depress the gun to find the weak point along the bottom. And I'm just going to farm him up. And again, 4,000 DPM when this tank is unloading. Let me clarify that. Of course, the vehicle's overall DPM is 2,000, but when it's actually unloading, it's 4,000 DPM on this tank. That's savage. Absolutely savage. And while you're not going to be able to improve it with vents, yada, 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 and actually the TS5, when it's fully decked out, if you were to put bond equipment with vents, and you had Brothers in Arms and you had a premium consumable, the TS5 is kind of like a Vipera that doesn't actually have the long reload afterwards, but I would make that trade any day of the week to be able to get 10 degrees of gun depression, literally double that of the TS5, to be able to get this turret, and also to have the complete lack of weak point on top of the vehicle, like the TS5 has. It's totally worth the trade, and also the increased mobility as well. I'd do it every single time. Now look, the TS5 is a different kind of vehicle. The TS5 is your tank for when you want to be absolutely raw, outrageous, and just deal with whatever's in front of you. Just keep holding down your W key without thinking and going through the enemy team. And you don't want to have the downtime like this vehicle does. However, I would say that this tank, if you're a knowledgeable player and you set it up correctly, will be way more brutal. If you're able to time your downtime with the way that the battle develops, this is going to be the new meta. This will be the best tier 8 tank destroyer for the above average player. Now, I'm not saying that the average and the below average player is not going to do well in this vehicle, but I just think that they might fall into traps where they mess up a shell or kind of get caught reloading. Whereas I think that a better player will be able to time their attacks, avoid those downtimes, and if you're able to negate that weakness of the vehicle, it will allow you to invest into the other statistics of the tank that just make this thing outrageously good. And while this vehicle is going to be, once again, I remind you all, 2 kilometers an hour when it's released in the 1.18 patch compared to how you see me playing now, still being able to drive around at this kind of speed is outrageous. And this kind of a situation, you know, just dumping on this ISU 152 while also having enough armor to be able to just casually avoid most of their damage, although I'm a little bit worried, I'm a little bit concerned. I'm going to look for a shell here. Is it going to finish him off? Oh yeah, it is. I had him even if he didn't fire at me and got respotted. And that's just terrifying. That was a tier 8 TD that we just shut down super hard, and I've got enough ammunition that I might as well just take a bit of a chance against the Super Hellcat as well. Now 3,700 damage in 3 shots, and we haven't really even taken any damage since that 50 TP prototype taught me a little bit of respect in this vehicle, and that I definitely should take this game a little bit seriously. This tank, it is gonna be an outrageous vehicle, and I would argue that Wargaming needed to do a little bit more to give it a few weaknesses. Now, I am happy that they're obviously making changes at literally the final hurdle of this vehicle to make it not quite so outrageous. But I am really worried that it is not going to be enough. Do we need to have like another Skoda T56 in the game? Let's wait for the conclusion. So here we go, now we're rolling out on Sand River, and I'm going to be using an accuracy device inside the firepower slot. I'm going to be using vents inside my survivability slot, and I'm going to be using coated optics on this tank as well to be able to give us enough view range to be able to spot our opponents. Now notice that when we're not running the turbo on this vehicle, it does end up being a substantial amount slower. And you'll also notice that when we're going up this slope here, the vehicle's rather lackluster power to weight ratio really is left lacking, and it reinforces to me just how valuable a turbo is on this tank. And while I do like the aiming device, because sometimes the shells are really important and you want to make them count, especially if you're playing against knowledgeable players who will push you during that 30-second downtime period that you will have, it's still tricky for me to have the final word as to whether I think the aiming device is going to be more important than a turbo on this tank. Otherwise, especially when the top speed limit is going to be 30 rather than 32, that will feel very slow. But 30 is still right within the region where a turbo is far from mandatory on a vehicle like this. If the vehicle only went at 20, mandatory turbo. 25, yeah, probably still mandatory turbo. But at 30, it's probably just quick enough that in a situation like this, on a map like this, you can be able to get away without it and to be able to invest in other statistics of the tank. My ideology is the previous build that you saw in the previous two games. It's kind of like your close quarters combat brawler build, and then this one is the park the bus, hold the ridge, spot for yourself, and derp your tanks out. That's what my plan is going to be. And it's been really interesting fighting players in this vehicle. Obviously they haven't watched my tank review yet, and hopefully when they do they'll have a better idea of how to deal with it. But just sitting in front of them. And what you're going to see in this game is that when I was playing this tank, I was trying to push myself as far forward to actually kind of find opponents that would test me. And do you notice that they all do the same thing? They just look, they look, they look, and they can't figure it out. And once again, a perfect mag in 5 rounds. We've managed to demolish the T-34-3. And now it looks like the enemies are going to realize that, well, maybe it does actually stop firing eventually and stop doing 4,000 DPM. The TVP is spamming HE rounds at me doing 19 damage a shot. Hopefully he's going to find his 2 key instead of his 3 key, which he does. But luckily the coated optics allows us to be able to spot him out in that situation, and he bounces a heat round. And I've nearly managed to reload. And it's all about keeping your turret towards what the next threat is. And do you notice how with kind of like turret control here, and by pointing our gun at the correct tank, we can kind of make them respect us. Unfortunately, this ELC has 0 respect for us, so they're going to manage to get our side, but they fired all 3 of their shells. It'd be nice if my team actually did something to the ELC, and we can turn our attention once again to this IS-3A. But 1 round in, we bounce heat here from every single enemy tank, and that was a disaster that our vehicle whiffed the shell there against the IS-3A, looking for the shot, put it against the T-44-100. We've blocked 3,600 damage in 3 minutes. Will we get the extra shell in? Unfortunately, we won't. And we fall. Look at the amount of gold that was fired at my tank. Yeah, and I'm still blocking over double my hit points and managing to do very respectable tier 8 damages in sub 3.5 minutes on a map like this. And clearly, considering that this player's managed to complete at least most of the campaign's missions with honors, they can't exactly be terrible, right? These are decent players on the enemy team that we nearly made look like amateurs in just an outrageously strong tank. That when you get up into a matchup like this, outside of hitting very specific weak points on the vehicle, there's precious little that you can do. The problem is that vehicles like the IS-3A and even vehicles like the 252U, you can manage to penetrate lots of their tank. So you don't need to be aiming at their weak points often to be able to go through them. And this thing is just that frontal behemoth juggernaut. And I'm just going to try and come to a conclusion for this tank. I think it's far too good. I think it's a little bit too mobile. I think it's got a little bit too much DPM. But more importantly, Wargaming, I seriously think that this thing needed to have a larger frontal weak point, possibly a cupola on top that was more prominent, a lot like the TS5. But it's too late. I only was able to test this vehicle 2 days before the release in 1.18. And as you all know, Wargaming never nerf premium tanks anymore. So if this vehicle goes into the game as it is, I think it's going to become one of, if not the best, tier 8 premium tank destroyers. And I expect it's probably going to sell like hotcakes. And I'm really not looking forward to playing against them. If I play a KV5, I'm going to get absolutely farmed by this thing. If I'm playing a Lerva, I'm going to get pretty much farmed by this thing. This is the perfect counter to the heavy juggernaut meta that has developed in World of Tanks. And I encourage all of you to swing by my stream on Friday, where hopefully I'm going to have one and I'm going to be grinding through it, as well as also through the Italian tank destroyers. I'm incredibly worried about how this one is going to turn out. And if it doesn't have one of the best win ratios of any of the tier 8 TDs, well, I'd be surprised, to say the least. So I want to make a passing mention to show you exactly where that 50 TP was able to penetrate me on Berlin map. And there you go. He shot right up through the tracks into the flap underneath the tank, and he did it 2 times on the trot. So definitely an advantage. Remember, where you shoot this tank, all along this bar here, you will be able to overmatch with every single gun. Then you shoot up into here, and if you have 120 1mm caliber gun, you can shoot the bar on top of the vehicle. Those are your opportunities to deal with the Vipera. So our first game on Paris was an ace tanker, although only 1,152 base. That is not even probably going to be a second class medal when this vehicle comes out. Still 4,300 damage dealt in our 3-minute lifetime, and we make a decent amount of credits profit, blocking enough to kill the vehicle multiple times over. The next one on Berlin, 1,321, an ace, but it won't be an ace for very long as soon as this vehicle is released. And trust me, if you want to be able to get your ace, you want to try and have a good game in this on release day. Otherwise, I believe the aces are going to be I can't believe it's going to be less than about 1,600, 1,700, or maybe even 1,800 to ace this thing after about a week of it being in circulation. And we make 72,000 credits profit in that game as well. Once again, blocking enough damage to be able to kill the vehicle once over. So ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that was my full tank review on the Vipera. I really hope it was useful for you. If it was and you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. And let me know in the comments what you think about this outrageous tier 8 Italian tank destroyer. Do you think it's as good as I'm suggesting? Or do you think it's just going to be okay? Or do you think it's going to be below average? Or do you think it's going to be outrageously overpowered? Let me know in the comments down below if you're planning on being able to pick one of these up. And yes, full disclosure, I have no idea how this thing is going to be sold, what the price will be, what you'll have to do to be able to get it. Wargaming has only told me that it will be available when the NDA is up. So I'm expecting it's going to be for sale in the premium store now. And good blooming luck meeting these things if people are setting them up correctly. And as always, thank you so much for watching. You've been epic, and hopefully I'll see you soon.